everyone. Good morning. It's that time again. It's Monday. It's the Bible study. And we've been going through the whole Bible. We started at Genesis. And we're going book by book and giving a basic overview and some important things that happened in that book and some important scriptures from the book. And basically giving you an overview so that when you go to read the book, you'll have a better understanding of what's going on historically in the book, what's going on spiritually in the book. So that's my intention anyway, to help you with that. But before we get into the book of First Chronicles, I just want to say good morning, and I hope you've all had a wonderful week this week. I hope you've really done well, because we're pretty much at the end of lockdown. And things are easing up in a lot of ways, although we still need to be careful. We still need to be washing hands, wearing masks, and considerate of others who could easily catch coronavirus. But overall, I'm loving the sense of freedom and being able to get out and to go more places. I don't mind wearing a mask. I wear my mask. It's a great excuse not to wear makeup, isn't it? Like, you just stick your mask on. It's like, why are you all complaining? Wear the mask, Anyway, so I just want to say good morning, and I hope everybody's well out there. I'm giving everybody a few seconds to join up with me. But what's great is, even if this is your first time watching, if you've not seen any of the others, it's okay, because I think I will explain it well enough that you'll know what's going on, and you can catch up later. That's the beauty of it all. You can go on YouTube, you can go on the family.church website and catch up on all of them. Okay, so that's the good news there. Anyway, let's get started. Let's talk about the book of First Chronicles. Okay, well, the title, Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles used to be one book, but because of scroll length, they had to break it up into two books, and that's the only reason why. Okay, so the Hebrew title for the book of Chronicles was called Words of the Days. So it's almost like our newspapers, which is our words of the days, isn't it? That tell you factual things that are going on in the world, factual things about what's going on in politics. So words of the days. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was called supplements or things omitted. So there are a few things added to this book that happened but weren't put in the other books. So they're mentioned in this book. Also called the Book of the Theocracy. Now, what does that mean? Theocracy sounds quite scary, big word. And basically what that means is when the government is influenced by theological or moral concepts. So theological would be like theo, has to do with God, okay? So it has to do with when our governments are influenced by morality, by theology, okay? So this is the book of the theocracy, all right? And how government was, at that time, influenced by God, okay? All right, so the author is most likely the priest called Ezra. Yes, and there is a book in the Bible called Ezra. Yes, that is his book. Okay, so he's a priest and a scribe, meaning he wrote stuff down, historical stuff. As it happened, he was keeping note of all that was happening in society and in government. And he is one of the guys who helped to lead the second of three groups of people who were returning to Jerusalem from Babylon. Now, where we left you off last week was that we know that the country was Israel. Well, we had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So we had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And they both, at separate times, by different groups, were taken captive and exiled out of their land. And it was because of the sin. God had promised them and said, listen, if you stay with me, if you do what I say, this won't happen to you. But if you do this thing, if you walk away from me, if you go into idolatry and serve other gods and give yourself over to sin and disobedience, then you will go into exile. It will happen. And it did happen. And we see that the Israel is taken exile they're taken exile by the Assyrians, and the southern people in Judah are taken captive and exiled by the Babylonians, okay? So that is where we left you last week. Sad times, very sad. But, little spoiler, I'm going to tell you this right off the bat, is that they do get, after 70 years, the people of Judah are released from their captivity, yay, and they are allowed by the king at that time, and I'm not going to talk so much about that bit this week. I'm going to talk about that next week because that has more to do with the book of 2nd Chronicles. But I have to mention that these people who were in exile for 70 years because of their sin get released by a pagan king called King Cyrus. But like I said, we're not going to I don't want to be too much of a spoiler and give it all out, all in one go. And so these people now, and I'm going to use this word quite a lot, are called post-exilic people, meaning after the exile, after they've been sent out of their land and scattered all over the place and ruled by Babylonians and Assyrians, and that they are no longer exiles after 70 years, but they are released and encouraged to go back to their land and build it up again, okay? So I have to explain where we left off so that you can see where we're going, okay? So, like I said, it was written, or believed to be written, by the priest Ezra, and it covers about 40 years, this book, from Saul's death to the beginning of Solomon's reign. That's what we're going to talk about today. It was probably written around 450 BC, and Chronicles was most likely written during the time while the Jews were dispersed through Persia because they'd been sent out in exile, right? And some now have returned to Israel because Cyrus, like I said, made a decree to release them and say, you're not under exile anymore, you can go back to the land. And we'll talk about how the exile of the people ends next week, but this book is written after the exile is over, okay? It is finished. They've done their time, okay, for the sins of their life. And the people are allowed to return to their land and to build it up again. Now that sounds like a great thing, right? But where do you start when you have nothing and you don't even have unity and you've been scattered abroad and you don't remember your history and you don't remember, this is 70 years on, okay? They've been in cultures that don't want to talk about Judah and Israel and about the one God. They've been in pagan cultures where they've been immersed in idolatry and the way other lands do things and the way other people, not God's people, do things. That's for 70 years. So, I mean, that is, a whole generation and more. So they've forgotten a lot of their history. There would probably have been people who didn't really realize their great and wonderful heritage with the one true God. So they're released to go back to their land, and they're going to begin with building their temple, because wherever the temple was where life sort of sprung out from. That is where that would probably be their capital city. That would be Jerusalem. It would be where the life of the city would be. And so to build up the temple is to build up their society, is to build up their, I'm hesitant to use the word pride, only because we associate pride with bad things. So maybe I'll say nationalism, to build up their nationalism, that they are a nation, that God is their God. So they would need to build this up, and they're going to start with building the temple. So this is Ezra the priest telling them their history, all the good bits, because we can't say for certain that it was Ezra, but there are many, many good reasons to believe that it was him, which I don't really need to get into. Maybe next week I'll mention why we think it's Ezra, but it is strongly believed that it was Ezra the priest. And the reason why we don't know who it is because he never says, I, Ezra, in it, have written this, but he refers to himself as the chronicler, so that's what we're going to refer to him as the chronicler. Okay, so when you hear me say the chronicler, it's basically me saying the writer of the book of 1 Chronicles, okay? Okay, so First Chronicles mirrors parts of 2 Samuel and 1 Kings, all the great parts of David's reign, which we've already read and already talked about, are included in this account. But some parts of David's reign are omitted completely, such as David's sin with Bathsheba, because the chronicler is writing the book of 1 Chronicles with a purpose, okay? The people, like I said, are post-exilic. They're post-exiles. They've just finished exile from Babylonian captivity. And the writer wants to help build the people back up again with their rich historical past, their history as God's people, reminders that obedience and closeness with God are what's going to bring blessing into their life, and that disobedience and idolatry got them into the mess of being in exile in the first place. Okay, so he leaves a lot of the bad stuff out, but not everything. There's some stuff you'll see mentioned. He wants to encourage those who have gotten comfortable in Babylon. They've been there 70 years, now they're coming back, that they should return to their land, the land that their God gave them, because some of them are going to be super comfortable. And like, I have my house here. I've got, animals and sheep, and, I made friends with the neighbors at the next farm and the next guy over there, and we're really good friends now, and, I have a life here. What am I going back to? I'm going back to a broken down land, no temple, what am I going back to? So Ezra is encouraging the people, I know you're comfortable, but here's your heritage. You got to read this, you got to understand this, and look what you're going back to. We want to build again. So that's what he's encouraging the people to do. So he's looking back in the book of 1st and in 2nd Chronicles as well, but we're not so much in that book yet. He's looking back at their glorious past so that the people can remember it and have hope for building an equally glorious future. But getting it right this time, without all the idolatry, without the sin, and without the disobedience to the one true God. So this account of their history includes none of the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, although these people are Israel now, because it's not so much about the name of the land, it's who the people are. Remember, they came from a man called Jacob, who was called Israel, that God called and named Israel, and it was the people of God who are Israel, okay? So, but this account, it does not include the history of the northern kingdom, which was Israel, because if you remember from last week, they had no godly kings at all amongst their leaders. They were heavy and deeply into idolatry, and this is not what Ezra, or the chronicler, wants them to remember. This account gives genealogies starting from Adam. Imagine knowing your genealogy starting with the very first man and the very first woman. So this genealogy starts, the genealogies in the book of 1 Chronicles start from Adam, but when they get to the family of Israel, or Jacob, it includes all the tribes of Israel, right? So that, remember, all these Jews out there are are from tribes. They're from one of the 12 tribes. So he's bringing back all of that in these genealogies that he talks about. It includes all the tribes of Israel, and eventually they get to the family of David. Very important, those genealogies of the royal family, because he is of the royal line, and the line from which the Messiah has been promised to come. The anointed one will come from the line of David. So you need a genealogy so that you know if he is your family. You know if this person who's claiming to be the Messiah is actually, is he from the line of David? Because then there's potential that he is the Messiah, right? Okay, so at least if he's from the right family line. So why is this book important if many of the stories have been already told in Samuel and Kings? Why would we then, if we're reading through the Bible from Genesis, and now we're all the way in 1 Chronicles, and we notice as we're reading, oh my goodness, first of all, it starts out with a whole bunch of boring genealogies. Then after that, it's stories I've already read about David. It starts out with some Saul, and then all about David, and then about Solomon, and you're like, I read this already. And the reason why I would encourage you to read 1 Chronicles, even though you read these stories in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, is because of the perspective from which these stories are now being told. Remember, this is all being written post-exile, after the exile is done, and it is being written by a priest and a scribe. Think about the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are all essentially the same story of Jesus, aren't they? But they're told from different perspectives. And so we see different facets of the same story, and it's the same with Chronicles. Ezra is a priest, so he has a slightly different and more spiritual take on things that have occurred in the history of the Jewish people. Here's one example. The death of Saul is told as that he dies in battle, right? And how his armor bearer wouldn't kill him, even though he's injured terribly, mortally wounded. He is going to eventually die, and Saul doesn't want the enemy, the Philistines, to get his body and do horrific things with it, and even torture him till the point of his death. It could be a little while. He's wounded, but he's not dead yet. So he says to his armor bearer, kill me, end it for me. And the armor bearer, out of fear and reverence, decides, no, I'm not going to do that. So Saul, in effect, kills himself. He falls upon his sword. And also that day, his sons died. And so that is how it is portrayed in 1 Samuel 31, verses 3 through 6. And it's told very factually. And we don't look at it unusually, because he is a warrior. He's in war. And that's one of the things that can happen to you quite naturally in war. You can die, and that is something that kings did. They sometimes had an armor bearer, and they'd say, end it for me so the enemy doesn't get my body and make sport with it, But he ends up having to do that for himself. So it's factually told in 1 Samuel. But when Ezra tells it, he writes that it is God who allows Saul's life to be taken because of Saul's disobedience. So we see Ezra sort of uncovering and peeling back the natural so that we can see spiritually what's happening. When we can only see with our natural eye a man dying in battle, which is not an unusual thing, that we see that it is actually a spiritual reason that God allowed his death. And last week we talked about, and I would encourage you to watch last week's, because we talked about the theme of the natural and the spiritual, and that they run parallel, and that we can see that there are spiritual things happening even when natural things are happening and we can't see the spiritual. And it is the same in this case with Ezra's retelling of the history. He's not changing things. He's just telling you spiritually what is happening alongside what is happening with the natural. He's not telling you fairy stories. He's telling you spiritually why this and this happened, okay? So it's a very natural death that has occurred with Saul, but we see that it is brought on by the disobedience to God, and Ezra points that out. Okay, so how is this broken up? Well, there's 29 chapters. It begins with the first 9 chapters, 1 through 9, of genealogies. And we get the genealogy of the patriarchs, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We get a genealogy of the royal family, so we have of David. And we get the priestly genealogies. So that would be the family of Aaron, okay? And all the people that came from there. Okay, next we have the history of the Theocracy. That's chapters 10 through 21. So in here, we have how the government was run and how it was impacted by the spiritual, by the words of God. And we get in chapter 10, so if it's 10 through 21 is the history of the Theocracy. In chapter 10, it begins with Saul's death. Then we have 11 through 21, that's David's reign, okay, the greatest king that they had, which all other kings were compared to, so we have David's reign. And lastly, we have discussion on the building of the temple. That's chapters 22 through 27. So with the building of the temple, we get first the revelation and the preparation. So to David, it is revealed how from God. God tells David how the temple is to be rebuilt and gives him all the plans. And David begins those preparations. That's chapters 22 through 27. And then we know that David cannot build the temple. God says to him, "You're a man of war. You've shed much blood. I do not want you building the temple, but your son Solomon will build the temple." So David charges Solomon and puts it into his care and the building of the temple, and then David dies. And those are chapters 28 and 29 of First Chronicles. So let's have a closer look at the breakdown. Okay, so chapters 1 through 9. Why all these genealogies? Oh my goodness, 9 chapters. It's just name after name after name, and this one begat that one, and this one begat that one, and this one begat that one, and it goes on and on and on. It's like something like the genealogies cover about 3,000 years of history just in that. Anyway, who reads these? Who reads genealogies? Well, think about this. It's popular in our day and age to look back on our histories, aren't they? To get genealogies done. Why do we get genealogies done? And it's because we want to know our past. We want to know who we're related to. Do we have some great people? Do we have some awful people? We want to know, don't we? We want to know our history. We want to know our relatives and who they are. They're fun for us, but to ancient cultures, the genealogies were proof of who they were, all right? The Bible's genealogies were important, right, in determining who could serve in certain roles. For example, the Levites. They included Levites working in the temple, as well as descendants of Aaron, and it was only descendants of Aaron who could serve as high priests in the temple. It was only a Levite in general who could work for the temple, but you had to know you were a Levite, right? So if you didn't know you were a Levite, if you had no proof, if you did not know your genealogy, then you were not getting in that temple, okay? You were not going to be anywhere near a high priest, or you were not going to be there if you couldn't prove who you were. Okay, in addition, many activities in the Mosaic law were limited to those who could prove that they were of Jewish descent. Were you from one of the tribes? You know? So remember that the original temple, because this is being written after everything's been done. This temple's been destroyed. They've been in exile for 70 years. And Ezra is writing this because he's in hopes that the temple will now be rebuilt, okay? So he's trying to get people to know, okay, here's the genealogy. Here is the line of Levi. Are you from the line of Levi? You know, are you from these tribes? Are you from any of these? Because they want new workers for the temple. So if they're going to rebuild the temple, they need to be genuine Levites to work there. Unless the person can prove that they're a Levite, they are not permitted to be working for the temple. The Bible's genealogies also prove many Bible prophecies, right? For example, Jesus had to be the Messiah, he had to be from the tribe of Judah. He had to be from the line of David if he were even going to be taken seriously at all by the people of his claims to be the Messiah. Also, we recognize that some of the names as we read through, obviously, first name, Adam, we know his story. We recognize many of the names as we skim through. And I mean, I would recommend having a skim through, because you will recognize some of the names from all we've talked about, from Genesis now to First Chronicles. You are going to recognize some of those names, and you know their stories. Each name represents a story. And some of those stories have been highlighted in the past books, and some very interesting and noteworthy stories as well. For example, in these specific genealogies in First Chronicles, there's an interesting man mentioned, and his name is Jabez. And he's in First Chronicles 4, verses 9 through 10. He's a man, we haven't heard of him before, and his name's Jabez, and he prays a prayer. And it's mentioned in these genealogies. And they made this into a famous book, which was published now 20 years ago. In the year 2000, The Prayer of Jabez was the name of the book. It was very popular. Many people were blessed by it. I've read it. I really enjoyed the book. But the scripture itself in the Bible, 1 Chronicles 4, 9 and 10, reads like this. And it's just mentioned right in there amongst the genealogies. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother named him Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. Imagine naming your child after your birth experience. Every single one of my children would be named, bore in pain, or gave me stretch marks, or, whatever. It's a good thing we don't really do that nowadays, right? Anyway, this poor guy's name is called because I bore him in pain. Oh my goodness. Now Jabez called on the God of Israel, saying, O God, bless me indeed, and expand my territory. Keep your hand on me, and keep evil from me, that I may not cause pain. And God granted him what he requested. Isn't that a strange little thing to be included into the genealogies? I do not believe that that is there by mistake. I believe it is there for these post-exilic people to read about Jabez and to say, even though this was the brand upon my life, that I was, bore in pain, and that my life is meant to cause pain to others, because that's basically what they're saying. Jabez didn't do anything to be born with this label. His mother bore him in pain. And his name actually means one who causes pain. And because of this label, he had a poor future stamped on his life. And it was one of his deepest desires that this label on his life of causing pain wouldn't cause pain to others. He didn't want to be someone who was causing pain to people. Who wants to be that? I don't want to be that. He did not want to be that. He did not want to wear this label in life. And he cried out to God about it. That God would sort out this problem. It's like this curse upon his life that he was going to cause pain to others and live a life of pain. And it says so beautifully that God honored Jabez's heartfelt prayer. And it says that God granted him what he requested. I believe, I don't think this is in there as a mistake. I believe it is for us to look back at and say, whatever labels have been put on me in my life, whether I've put those labels there myself for my stupidity, for my bad actions, or if other people have labeled me things, labeled me dumb, labeled me, just will achieve nothing in life, you are this, that, the other, whatever label that people have put upon you, you could cry out to God and say, no, God, I do not want to wear this label in my life. I don't want to be this person who has no future. I want to have a future that is now in you. I am that new creation in you, and all things are possible for me because nothing's impossible for God. Can you change this, God? And with Jabez, God honored that, and I believe that this is there. So people who feel they have this label on their life can cry out to God and just know that God will honor you. God wants you to have a bright future. Okay, we talked about Jeremiah 29:11 last week. That famous scripture where it says, where he wants to give us a hope and a future. Well, I believe he wants to give all of us a hope and a future. You do not have to wear the labels that others have put on your life. Come to God, go to him, cry out to him, and he can change that for you, okay? Okay, we're going to talk about chapters 11 through 21 now, which is David's reign. David was a great leader, okay, for many reasons, all right? First, he obeyed God, and to God, this is what made a great king, right? He talked about many of the kings in the past books of the Bible, and it said this was a good king, he was an evil king, this was a great king, this was not a great king, and it all was based on whether they served God and caused the people that they ruled over, he encouraged them to serve God. So it was, David was a good king, and he was the king that God actually caused the scribe here, Ezra, to highlight, to put the spotlight on, because he was the king that all other kings were held up to see if their behavior was great or not great. He led others to love and worship God, God only. There was no idolatry in him. He wasn't perfect, and you'd think this is what would potentially cause him to be considered a bad king. We know he messed up with Bathsheba. We know he took a census that wasn't allowed, and it brought, judgment upon the people. But even in his weakness, we see that he was a man after God's own heart. That was what God called him, because he repents straight away. And we see that even in the book of 1 Chronicles. So it's not like the bad things he did were completely ignored. But we do see how he got it right straight away. He repents, he's humble, and he comes back to God fully. Also, about David, why is he a great leader? Well, he is a great leader, and a great leader attracts great leaders, okay? He attracted what the Bible calls great and mighty men. They were drawn to him, and they were willing to follow David even while he was still on the run from Saul. Now, although 1 Chronicles doesn't really speak of David's running away from Saul for all those years, I think it was something like 7 years or something like that, may have even been more, that he was running from Saul all those years, hiding out in caves and stuff. It doesn't talk about Saul chasing after him in all those hard years, but it does talk about the great and mighty men, the mighty men of David, and how they were drawn to him, willing to follow him while he was still on the run from Saul, while he was hiding out. He wasn't even king yet. Okay, let's talk about David's mighty men, because they are some of the most inspirational people mentioned all the way from, 1 Samuel all the way now to 1 Chronicles, and we'll see probably in 2 Chronicles. It's a leader doesn't lead on his own. He needs great and mighty people who will help him carry out what he's asking. Here's a quote. This quote is just spot on. I'm going to read this quote, and it was a quote from a missionary called David Livingstone. He was a great missionary to Africa, and I'm going to read this to you, okay? And, yeah. When David Livingstone, the missionary pioneer, was working in Africa, some friends wrote to him, "We would like to send other men to you. Have you found a good road into your area yet?" Now, obviously, David Livingstone would have been in Africa. There were no roads. Roads don't just spring out. People build these roads, and it was all, trees and bushes and... Ugh. Anyway, Livingstone writes back to these people who want to send help out to him in the form of good men. Livingstone wrote back, "If you have men who will only come if they know there is a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come if there is no road at all." And I got that quote from an article called God's Mighty Men by Stephen J. Cole. I could not use this quote. And this quote sums up the heart attitude of David's men. They were just willing, and they were so willing beyond what was reasonable. So what is a nation without its national heroes, right? The mighty men. David had 37 men, and 3 of the 37 were his elite and faithful men. Okay, I'm just going to quick talk about some of these mighty men. There was, when David was hiding out, and he was in a cave called the Cave of Adullam, he just says, he's reminiscing, and he says, "Oh, how I'd love to have some water from this well that I had in Bethlehem. It was just the most amazing water." Well, these mighty men of his heard this, and they just think, you know what? We are going to cross enemy lines, and they would have had to cross enemy lines and risk their lives to get this glass of water. But they go and do it. They cross the enemy lines, and David didn't ask them to do this, but they wanted to do what their leader wanted, what would bring inspiration and help, and it just meant so much. And they went and got this water, and they brought it to David, and David is blown away. Now, we don't see that in 1 Chronicles, that story. We see it in 2 Samuel, but they speak of these men and of the time in the Cave of Adullam, and I just wanted to point out that these are the kind of men we're dealing with. And David doesn't even drink that water because that water is too precious. He actually pours it out as an offering before God because it represented the life's blood of his men. Okay, in chapter 12, many of the men are defecting to his side, away from Saul's side. This is when he was still on the run from Saul. And these men could see that God was with David, and they wanted in. They wanted to be where God was, and we see that in 1 Chronicles chapter 12. We see the mighty warriors mentioned here in chapter 12, and they were such great warriors. They could use the bow and arrow perfectly with both the right and the left hand. It mentions that. So they were really great warriors. These are the caliber of men, the type of men that were joining up with David. They mention these Gadite warriors also in chapter 12, and it says they were wild like the lions in appearance, but as agile as gazelles in speed. And they did this amazing feat, which is mentioned in chapter 12. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue twisted here. They actually crossed the Jordan River to help win a battle when it was at flood stage. Now, I went and looked at what the Jordan River today looks like when it is at flood stage, and you can look that up on YouTube. It is crazy. It is not almost humanly possible to cross crazy, rapid running water like the Jordan River. These men did it. These men had such a heart for David and for the people and wanted victory on behalf of God that they were willing to risk their lives to do such great and mighty feats. In chapter 14, David builds himself a palace with supplies that are sent to him by a king called King Hiram of Tyre. And we're going to see how later on, after David dies, that this man, Hiram of Tyre, also helps Solomon because of his friendship with David. David also, it's mentioned in chapter 14, was great in the eyes of those kingdoms far and near, and they feared and revered him. Okay, he was a great leader. Chapter 15 talks about David bringing the ark to Jerusalem. We've read that story in the past. It does mention his failed attempt where the man who touched the ark dies. Remember that? But it also speaks of his non-failed attempt 3 months later, which shows how he puts such a great emphasis on the worship of God. He describes the ark, Ezra describes the ark coming back into the city, into Jerusalem, and his writing is such that you can feel the bigness of the occasion, the celebratory atmosphere. Remember, he's writing to encourage the post-exilic people to come back to your great heritage, come back, look at the celebration that was around the ark, look how your people brought it back in. Look at the amazing God we serve, and how kings of old in the glory days of Israel and the glory days of the people, how it was celebrated. Come back to that. It's a call to come back to that. Okay. Chapter 16, the ark is put into the tent that David prepared for it, and this becomes David's tabernacle. There is no temple at this point. Solomon hasn't built that temple yet. Anytime you hear of David worshiping at the tabernacle, let's say in the Psalms or in any other places in the tabernacle, it's probably at this tent in Jerusalem, this place, because there is no solid temple yet. It's just this tent that David set up for the tabernacle, for the ark. Sorry. Okay. In chapter 16, verse 7, we see a man named Asaph. You'll notice he wrote many of the Psalms in the book of Psalms. Psalm 50, Psalms 73 through 83. And if you want to see the caliber of the man who was David's worship leader, you can go and read those Psalms. We also see that in chapter 16, verse 37, he is ministering before the ark during this bringing of the ark into Jerusalem, where they're going to set it into the tent that David builds. Interesting to note, David sets Asaph, and Asaph, who's in charge of the worship leaders, to around the clock worship to be before the ark. So Asaph is in charge of all of that. Okay. So overall, chapter 16 is where the ark is set in place in the tent, and it's a reminder again to these post-exilic people of a time of greatness, unity, and blessing, a reminder of their heritage. And the chronicler wants these post-exilic people to read this and to feel the nostalgia and the celebration. Okay, chapter 17. This is super important to the rest of the whole Bible. So I would take note of chapter 17. David wants to build a house for God. But God says, and this is paraphrased, this is me paraphrasing, God says to him, to David, he says, listen, David, I've been living in tents now for a long time, and I'm fine with that, although I love your heart for wanting to build a house for me. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build you a house, right? Now I'm going to read to you chapter 17 from the Message Bible, verses 7 through 10. Not actually the whole thing, but if you know anything about the Message Bible, it's in chunks. So it says 7 through 10, but I'm not reading the whole 10. I'm going to read it to you, and here's what it says. This is what God says to David about building him a house. I'm about to make you famous, ranked with great names on the earth. I'm going to set aside a place for my people Israel and plant them there, so they'll have their own home and not be knocked around anymore. Nor will evil nations afflict them as they always have, even during the days I set judges over my people Israel. And finally, I'm going to conquer all your enemies. And now I'm telling you this, God himself will build you a house. When your life is complete, he's talking to David here, and you're buried with your ancestors, then I'll raise up your child to succeed you. This is speaking of Solomon, a child from your own body. But this bit is speaking of Jesus. And I'll firmly establish his rule. He will build a house to honor me, and I will guarantee his kingdom's rule forever. I'll be a father to him, and he'll be a son to me, and I will never remove my gracious love from him, as I did from the one who preceded you. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will always be there, rock solid. So that is the most important thing, because the Jews will then be waiting from this promise for the Messiah that will come through the line of David. He is called, the Messiah just means the anointed one. So they're waiting for this anointed king who will rule forever, this rock solid ruling forever and ever. So that can't be fully Solomon, can it? Some of that is Solomon, but it's speaking of Christ because his kingdom lasts forever. David is overwhelmed, and he is thankful, and he prays, and he says these words. And I believe this is in there so important for these post-exilic people to read again the words of David. And I'm going to read this, what David prays and what he puts in this prayer. And in his prayer, he says, "And who is like your people, like Israel, a nation unique on earth, whom God set out to redeem as his own people and become famous for it, performing great and fearsome acts, throwing out nations and their gods left and right. As you saved your people from Egypt, you established for yourself a people, your very own Israel, your people forever, and you, God, became their God." No mistake that Ezra reiterates the words of David and puts that in there, because he is saying to the people, this is your heritage. This is who you are. You need to know who you are. As you come back into the land of promise, come back knowing who you are. You are God's special people, okay? And he's pointing out all of this greatness about the reign of David, because he's pointing out this. David was a good king, but an even greater king is coming who will exceed David's goodness in every way. And there's no way to point out how great this eternal king is going to be unless Ezra points out what a good earthly king David is and has something to compare that to. He's like, David was great, but what is coming will blow your mind, because he is going to be the king of all kings, the greatest king that ever was and that ever shall be. And we know that king to be Jesus. Okay, so these are some important things in the book of 1 Chronicles and in 2 Chronicles, because that theme carries over. Okay, chapters 18 through 19. David has battles where he and his men are victorious, and they bring victory to Judah. Ezra wants the people to see that they have a victory in their past, victory in battle. It can all happen again. And David, in chapter 18, verses 7 through 8, acquires loads of bronze from one of his conquests. And all that bronze gets used later in the making of Solomon's temple. Every bit of bronze that is put into Solomon's temple was gotten from a conquest that David had. And you know what I love about that point? That David used what was taken from the enemy to worship God. How we can apply that to our lives. That what we take back with our faith, with our trust in God, with believing God, with saying, God, I have lost my joy, bring it back. We can use that then for God. God, I have lost whatever, my health. Can you bring it back? When God restores health, how we can use that health to honor God, to use our strength and our ability to honor God. Whatever the enemy is trying to plunder from you, I have this funny feeling that it is something that use your faith, use your trust in God. Come to God and say, I want this back, God. The enemy, I want plunder from the enemy, that I could use it to worship you, God. Okay? So that's what I love about that point. Okay? All right. So chapter 18, verses 14 through 17 speaks of the whole Absalom rebellion period of time, but no mention of Absalom or the rebellion, which was a huge thing. That was huge in David's life, but it's all omitted. And it was also the time when David was at his weakest. None of that is mentioned. He was the most broken at that point, but none of that is mentioned. What is mentioned is David's mighty men and how they helped him during this weak period of time that we know he was weak from reading the past books. But these post-exilic people, if they're only looking at this, they're going to see a strong king with mighty men. Now, it's not like he wants to, what he's trying to do is he's trying to build the people up. It's not going to build the people up to know about Absalom and about how everything was taken from David. But it will help the people to know that David had mighty men who were there willing to undergird David and help him in this time. And that is what is pointed out, because it's all with a purpose. Chapter 20, the whole Bathsheba period of time. Remember Bathsheba? But without Bathsheba, no account of the sin of David with Bathsheba. Rather, we see how David's men are destroying Philistines in this period of history. And Ezra, again, isn't hiding David's mistakes, a big cover-up. They were well known. Everybody knew about David's sin. It was not that it wasn't known. Rather, he was choosing to highlight what was going to be beneficial to building up the people. Okay, chapter 21. This shows David having made a mistake with the census. Remember, he took a census that brought a lot of judgment onto the people. And he shouldn't have taken that census. But straight away we see, so it's not like he's covering up all of David's mistakes. Straight away we see him repenting. We see David repenting. And the chronicler shows how David was willing. He speaks these words. He's willing to take any punishment on himself. He's like, God, punish me. I did this. Punish me. Punish my family and me, but not the people. And, you know, it's something so like Jesus in that. Because Jesus took all the sins on himself. And he said, take it on me, God. Pour your wrath on me, not on the people. I will take the judgment for the sins. I'll do it. I'll do it. And it was so, and David is showing that again and again, pointing to a future messianic anointed king. If David was willing to take all this judgment of God upon himself, how much more willing was the Messiah going to be to take the sin, to bear the judgment for all sin on himself, right? Okay? So it's pointing again toward this Messiah who was going to be even greater than David. And David was pretty great. Okay, chapter 23. Solomon is made king, even while David is still alive. Now, you might remember there was another son that when David was ill and in poor health, quite old, there was a son, one of David's sons, who took advantage of that and set himself up as king. But David got wind of that, found out about it, and immediately set Solomon straight away as king. The coronation happens and he becomes king. But again, we do not hear about this treasonous son. We don't hear about him. We only hear how Solomon came into being. And that's okay because it is in the history books. It's just not what is necessary to highlight for these post-exilic people. Chapters 24 through 25 speaks of Aaron's family of Levites, okay? The Levites, the priestly people. Important again, because if you were a Levite, then you can join in the temple work and in the temple worship. And you get the sense in reading in chapters 24 and 25 of a throwback to the glory days of the Levites in the temple as they obeyed God in how they worshipped. I also noticed that the workers among the Levites, it says in chapter 25, I believe, or 24, 25, that the worshipers, that they were trained musicians and they were skilled, okay? There were no bad notes, no pitchy singers. There was skill and ability in the temple, and that was important to God, okay? So I'm just putting it out there to say that, you know, if your worship leaders in church say, you know, you need a little training, can we help you with your voice, or we'd love to help you with, you know, with your musical abilities, we'd like to help you, or if they suggest you get some training, don't be hurt by that. Skill blesses God and blesses God's people, okay? Okay. Notice in chapters 26 and 27 that there is order in God's house. There's security guards are set in place for the temple. Financial experts for the offerings of the temple. Also, just in government in general, this is not for the temple, the organization of the military. There's mention of tribal administrators. So for all the tribes, there were administrators. There were people who looked after King David's property, his animals, his flocks. It mentions David's close political counsel, all the people who were close to him, who gave him counsel, but again, not mentioning any of the treason that certain of those leaders committed during the whole Absalom time, okay? So we're looking at the setup of how things were set up in the temple, how things were set up in the government, okay? And I can see how the chronicler is showing these post-exilic people almost a handbook of all the plans of the old time, of the good times. And in a sense, it's him saying, here's a guide for building your lives again. Okay, here's a handbook of what will be needed and who will be needed and how to set it all up. So they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Basically, he's saying, we did this before, now let's do it again. Come on, people, we can build. We can do this. He's encouraging the people. Chapter 28, okay, we're nearly at the end here. David's farewell speech. And in it, he includes that God chose Judah, the tribe. Specifically, he chose David. And then also specifically, out of all of David's sons, he chose Solomon. And he points to the promise in this final words, this farewell speech to his son, of the Messianic king, reminding him of that, reminding the people of that, which are going to come from his line. And his parting words in a speech to Solomon. Now, I always think the parting words of a person are so important. And now, at this point, he's speaking these from a time of general health. He is a little bit old and unhealthy. But the parting words are so important because it's the things you want people to know, because you're not going to be able to say these things to them again, and you want to leave them with these parting, what is your last and important thoughts, right? And this is what he says, these important words to Solomon. And it's 1 Chronicles 28, 9 and 10. And you, Solomon, my son, get to know well your father's God. Serve him with your whole heart and eager mind, for God examines every heart and sees through every motive. If you seek him, he'll make sure you find him. But if you abandon him, he'll leave you for good. Okay, so David also gives, as well as these important words, he gives all of the plans that God gave him about the temple to Solomon. Even though Solomon gets all the credit for the temple, we call it Solomon's temple, but David did all the groundwork and received the plans from God for it, and helped get some of the stuff together from, Hiram of Tyre. Remember that friend helped get all that stuff. But Solomon carried out the plans, and so Solomon gets the name put on that temple, which is Solomon's temple. Okay, but it really came out of the heart of David. Okay, last chapter, 29. The temple is being built at this point. Such a time of rejoicing. And the exiles are reading about this joyful time. And it speaks of it in chapter 29, verses 14 through 19, about the joyous free will giving of the people to build the temple. David obviously needed funds to build the temple. And he wanted the people to be part of the building of the temple. It wasn't just his temple, it was a temple for the people. And so he put it out there that there was a free will offering. He said, if you feel it in your heart to give to the building of the house of God, then give. And the people gave so abundantly of their free will. This is mentioned because of the unity of purpose. The chronicler wants the people to see the unity of purpose that the people from the past had. And he wanted that unity of purpose to be back in these new people, in these people that were coming through again to this post-exilic land, to the land that God gave them. And he's saying, come on, people, there was unity of purpose once. There was unity. We can do this again. We can build again, okay? The heart was there once, and it will be there again, okay? So Solomon is established in strength as the ruler at that time, and then in the last chapter, David passes away at the ripe old age, which I think is not really that ripe and not really that old, of 70. And it says, though, that he is full of age and full of days, and then he goes and rests with his forefathers. Now, obviously, I don't think 70 is very old, but let us remember that David was a warrior. He led in difficult times, and I think his hard life, I think it wore hard on his body, and I think that is where that comes from, the fact that he, it says that he was full of days. Boy, he probably lived 70 years, but it was probably more like like 110, with what it did to his body. Okay, so on a personal note, the story of the exiles is the story of all humanity. We are exiles. Remember Adam and Eve? They were exiles from the garden. But on an even more personal note than just taking it to Adam and Eve, let's look at our own lives. We, the people, humanity, we are exiles if we are not with God, because we were created to worship God. All people were created to have a relationship with their Maker, with their God, the one true God. So if we are not following God, or if we were with God and we've fallen away from God, we are exiles if we're not with him. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, there's the story of the prodigal son. Okay? Now we all know the story of the prodigal son, that there's a father and he has a son. And the son says, he gets it in his head that I don't want to be in your house anymore. I don't want to live in your home anymore. I don't want to live under your care and your protection anymore, Father. But actually, I just want everything that's coming to me, all my inheritance. I want to go out and I never want to see you again. So that's what happens. The son takes all of his money, all of his inheritance that's due him, goes out, lives hard, lives fast, lives in foreign lands away from the home of his father. And he loses everything. He loses all his money. He loses all his friends when he loses all his money. And he finds himself begging for work, begging, and he gets a job as a pig farmer or working on a pig farm. And he's starving to death, and he wishes to even eat the food that the pigs is eating because he's got nothing. He finds himself in a foreign land, away from his father, away from his home, away from the goodness of everything that his father had for him, with nothing. And so he gets it in his head, and one day he comes to his senses and he says, I had it the servants in my father's house have it better than me. I'm starving, begging for what the pigs are eating. He said, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back and I'm going to beg my father to let me even be a servant in his house. So he heads back home and he's rehearsing this speech in his head. He's rehearsing it and he's saying, I'll go back and I'll say to my father, he's on the road now, which is right up where his father's house is. And it's obvious that his father can see him from like a top window, because his father must have been watching and waiting and looking out for if his son should return. So he's on the road, and at this point the son is rehearsing the words in his head of what he's going to say to his father. I'll say to him, just make me a servant on this, I'll humble myself, I'll repent. And it says this, and this gets me every time. So Luke chapter 15, verses 19 through 20. So the son is saying this. He's rehearsing these words. He says, I'm going to say to my father this. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And then in the next verse it says, and he arose and he came to his father, meaning he was approaching the father's house. He was coming back from exile. And this is the bit that gets me every time right here. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his son's neck and kissed him. So that father was watching and waiting for all that time for the son to return. And what's important to notice about the story of the prodigal son is, one, Jesus is telling this story, okay? Jesus, God incarnate, is telling this story to open up to people what his heart is, what the Father's heart is toward his people returning to him. And this is a story coming out of the mouth of Jesus about how even before the son was just even down the road, even when he just in his heart said, I'm going to come back to the Father, that the Father saw him a long way off and ran. He ran to the Son. Now remember that it's the Son who did the leaving. The Father never left. The Son did the leaving. The children of Israel did the leaving. The Father never went anywhere. He was always where he always was, right there for them. And the minute that they got it in their heart to return, God is so on the page with someone who wants to come back to God. Someone who wants to return to the Father. And the heart of the Father is what it is in these words of Jesus, where it says, but when the Father saw him from a long way off, he had compassion, and God runs to that sinner returned home, and he falls on the neck of that person in an embrace, and he hugs them. Now, just think back to a hug and an embrace that you had with maybe a loved one you haven't seen in a long time. I've had a lot of those kind of hugs because I live in the United Kingdom, but my home is the United States. So whenever, and many years sometimes would go by where I wouldn't see family, where I wouldn't see friends. And when I would go back and see them after a long time, years and years, once it was 10 years, once I went back, and when I saw them, I would just hug them, and you embrace these people, and you fall upon their neck like you never, like you want to just, like you want that to just be a photograph, just stopped in time. You never want to leave. You hug them like you want to. You're drinking in the way they smell. You're drinking in every bit of them because you miss them, because you love them so much. And that's the Father's heart. And that was the Father's heart for the exiles. They were coming back to their land. They were going to come back to God. And that is, if we're going to take this into the New Testament, and Jesus tells this story of the prodigal son, that is the story that God is now bringing to all people. He has opened it up to all humanity, that we can come back to Him. If you are far from God in any way, in any area of your life, anything, even in just an attitude of your heart, you're mostly with God, but there's been a few things that you've been far from God in. Maybe it's in, I don't know, forgiveness toward people. You know, you love God, but you say, you know, there's people, I just can't forgive them. I can't come back. I can't. You know what? Right now, get it in your heart to come back to the Father's house in that. Come back, and I promise you, the Father will come running to you when He sees your heart wants what He wants. And He will embrace you, and He does not want to let His people go. His children. And later on in that scripture, we see the son is still trying to say, but Father, I'll be a slave in your house. I'll be a servant. And it's like the Father's like, be quiet. And he puts a beautiful robe of sonship and a ring on the son's finger. And he puts sandals on his feet. And he redresses him because he's dressed in the rags of exile. And he wants to make him into who he is, to remember who he is. You are my son. This is how my son dresses. And not only that, but he kills the fatted calf that's been getting ready for a celebration, and he kills it for that celebration, the celebration of one who returns to God and is no longer in exile. So that is what the basic premise of 1 Chronicles is all about. Now read it, enjoy it, and I'm going to end it right here. And I will encourage you, read in Luke chapter 15 the story of the prodigal son, because it is amazing, and it is the words of Jesus, and it is the heart of God for those who are far from God to come back. Have a wonderful week. Enjoy.